thank you very much for coming.
You're very welcome.
I appreciate it. You know, you've got an interesting life, I think, from what I picked up from I met you last time.
Well, it was.
It was. Being sort of a retired neuroscientist, you told me professor of human anatomy as well.
I used to teach human anatomy.
Where did you teach that?
University of Sheffield.
Amazing. And obviously your Japanese swordsmanship stuff.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
But I'm going to pass on to Jacob for the first question because we're going to start quite broad.
So on neuroscience, I don't really know much about it. So can you just explain what is neuroscience and why is it important?
Neuroscience is a scientific study of the central nervous system. So we're looking at how the structure and function of the brain, the spinal cord and the nerves. But it's not just the function, it's also the anatomy, the way the cells are arranged and how things are wired up. So that's essentially what neuroscience is.
Right.
And why did you go into that then particularly?
I sort of fell into it really. I did a degree in physiology, which is the study of the mechanisms by which the body works. And I just found things like vision and the neuroscience stuff a lot more interesting than say the endocrine system or the way the kidneys work or something. I mean, kidneys are boring, vital but boring.
So, what sort of problems do people come in with? Would come into you with?
Oh well, no. See, that's the demarcation there. You're assuming I'm a neuroscientist, not a neurologist.
Okay.
So a neurologist would be somebody who looks at pathologies and diseases of the brain and the central nervous system, whereas a neuroscientist is the person who sort of works out how things work. So it's a bit like an aerospace engineer for Boeing will know all about airflows over turbines and hypersonics and this and that and structures and metals and what have you, but it's the mechanics that screw things into position. So medical people, the doctors are the people who screw things into position and make people better, but they don't devise or necessarily devise the treatments,
right,
or the understanding of the condition or the what have you. So it's a bit of a biomedical science is the science that underpins medicine. That's essentially what it is. Yeah.
Interesting. So you mentioned vision a little bit, but is there anything particularly about the brain that fascinated you when you were younger, which gave you that kind of thirst for knowledge to go into it?
No, not particularly. I mean, the thing that really piqued my interest in science was somebody who you hadn't heard of last time we spoke, and that's Mr. Spock from Star Trek.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. You know who Mr. Spock is, do you?
No.
Jake? Oh my goodness.
It's that guy with the pointy ears on Star Trek, isn't it?
I've never watched Star Trek.
Oh my goodness. Oh, I'm tempted to throw you out of the house. Mr. Spock was a character, half human, half Vulcan character on Star Trek, and he was a science officer on the Enterprise. Oh. And he was characterised by pure logic. He wanted to, his race cast aside emotions and tried to behave in the most logical way possible. Anyway, for some reason as a kid, I found that absolutely fascinating. And so the science part of it is what got me into science. Neuroscience, as I say, really happened with my degree. I initially went to university to do psychology because I thought I wanted to understand behaviour and all sorts of usual things. And then when I started doing psychology, I realised it wasn't the field for me. I wanted to look at the organic part of the brain and the central nervous system and how that works, rather than the performance of those systems. Although there is some overlap, of course. I wanted to know what was under the bonnet of the car, rather than how the car drives, and I think that's the sort of difference between the two. Both vital, but in different ways. So I think.
When you were working, did you have any particular research that you did about a certain area of the brain or a certain way the brain operates, and what was that in particular?
So in my PhD, so that's the first bit of research that anybody really gets to do, isn't a PhD, researching for their doctorate. I was looking at something called proprioception.
Is that, it might be wrong, is that where you kind of feel that your body is yours, or you have this kind of sensation that you are in your body or something like that?
So if I say to you now, you can tell me the orientation of your legs and your feet without looking at them.
Yeah.
Because you're getting information from these little organs called muscle spindles embedded in your muscles that send information back to your brain about muscle length. And your brain can work out what the orientation of your limbs are, because they know how long your limbs are and the joints and what have you. And so you have this sense of your position in space without having to use visual information.
Yeah. I remember learning about that. It's like an extra sense that we have. You can close your eyes and you know what position your hand is in without looking at it. Yeah.
It's often called the sixth sense, and it's not seeing dead people as in that famous film. Yeah. But so if you play an instrument, do you play an instrument?
A little bit, yeah.
What do you play?
Guitar and trying to learn piano.
Okay, so if you don't look at your left hand and you make a G chord, can you do that? Can you make a G chord with your left hand? No, I mean actually make a G chord with your left hand without looking at your hand. No, obviously not.
No.
So you can do this, G, D, A7 or whatever, C. You can do these things without looking at your hand because the proprioception from the muscles in your forearms go back to your brain.
Isn't that just memory?
Well, yes, you have to have the memory of the chord, but if you don't know that you're in a C chord, your index finger goes on the first fret of the B string, then you need to know what the orientation of your hand is in order to do that. If you gave me a guitar that I'm unfamiliar with, I might struggle a little bit at first, and I would have to use visual information, but after a while I would adapt. And it's that adaptability.
Without that, people wouldn't be able to play such complex melodies on a guitar because they would constantly have to be looking at their fingers.
And some people do, and sometimes you do have to. If you're doing a fast harmonic minor run, sometimes you do have to look at your hand and make sure you're... But sometimes that trips you up. Have you ever done that thing when you're running down a long flight of stairs and you're running really, really quick and you start looking at your feet and trying to...
Yes.
And then you fall down the stairs and smash your head on the way. Yeah, you get in your own way. Whereas if you allow the automatic systems, that's things like the cerebellum and other things, take over, they will just do these things all
I also kind of feel like that with driving, right? I drove better when I passed my test and I didn't have an instructor there always watching me, because when the instructor was watching me, I was thinking about driving.
Yeah.
But as soon as I'd passed and I was on my own and I was just driving, it all kind of happens naturally. And I was saying this to my friend, like, it feels often that I get in the car and then I end up at my destination and someone's driven for me, but apparently it was me.
So that's called automaticity. And it is that ability of your systems to monitor and do everything automatically. It's a little bit dangerous. I'm an advanced driver as well, and they tell you not to do that. You should be aware of what's happening around you. But very often, if you're distracted, you can just drive. There's actually a couple of famous cases of people who have a particular type of seizure. And this, during a seizure, you don't know what's happening. You're completely unconscious. But these are called fugue states. And do you know what a fugue is in music? It's sort of, it follows a pattern. Bach was very famous for them. It follows a particular pattern, and you have several lines that work with each other and sort of interpose with each other and harmonise with each other. But in the neurological sense, a fugue state was, the classic case was this guy who was a vacuum cleaner salesman or something in the States. And every week he would have to put in his mileage so he could claim his petrol back. And I mean, he was only working in his local area, maybe 50 miles or something or other, but he was doing something like 600 miles a week. And his company said, why are you claiming for 600 miles? And he says, well, that's what's on my clock. That's what's on the odometer on my car. And they said, well, we're not paying this, and what have you. So he went to his doctor. Doctor did an EEG where they put electrodes on the scalp to see what's brainwaves doing, and said, look, you have epilepsy. And on further investigation, what they found was that when he was having a seizure, the part of the seizure was driving his car whilst being unconscious. So he would stop at traffic lights. He probably didn't change gear because it was America, but he was using the brakes. He was indicating. He was driving completely normally, but he was unconscious.
Wow.
Wait,
he was completely unconscious.
So he was driving the car whilst not being in the car?
He was in the car.
But he wasn't aware he was doing it because he was having a seizure. He had epilepsy, so his body knew what to do without...
So he was just driving around because... He
just kept driving around and around and obeying all the highway code and everything, so the police never stopped him, but he was actually having a seizure and he was unconscious. So these are some of the weird sort of things that can happen with the brain. You can have that type of seizure. There are many, many other different types of seizure that can do lots of things. So, for example, there was a case probably about 12 years ago where a man killed his mother-in-law. He stabbed her to death. And he said, I didn't know I did it. I was unconscious. It didn't happen to me. They investigated him. He had epilepsy. And they decided that he had been in a fugue state and he'd stabbed his mother-in-law to death while he was in a fugue state. I'll tell you what, I want that lawyer if I'm ever getting any trouble, because it seems a bit far-fetched, but he got off with it.
I've never thought of it like that. Like, a lot of criminals must just have it wired inside of them like that.
They get into a state that they can't really control, and it's kind of just, yeah.
Well, there's also different levels of inhibition, I guess. You and I, and the average law-abiding citizen, we don't do things because we have a level of
Morality.
yeah, morality might be the word, or there's a thing called Kohlberg's levels of moral reasoning. Have you heard of that? Yeah. So it's a complicated sort of thing, but you can basically break it down into three levels. And the most basic level of moral reasoning,
Just on risk reward, isn't it? And like cost versus.
well, no. The most basic level is actually not doing something because you don't want to get caught
Yeah.
and go to jail. Then the one above that is not doing something wrong because you don't want your peers, your friends, your family to judge you badly. And the highest level is, I mean, I'm simplifying all of this, is you don't do something wrong because you know it's an immoral thing to do and you shouldn't.
Yeah, and you have like
wrong.
higher principles that might go above the law. So, for example, when we studied it, we looked at a case where a guy couldn't afford life-saving medication for his wife who was really ill, and it's like, what's the morally right thing to do? Is it steal the medication, or is it let your wife die? And in that case, you would say it's better to steal and break a law, so you have kind of higher ethical principles than the law you've been given, and then that was an example of, like, I think it was post-conventional morality.
Yeah. And I think that the actual levels themselves are much more in depth, and there are many of them.
But anyway, I want to go back to what we said there. It links to another question later, but I want to know what your work specifically on proprioception was.
Right. Yes. So proprioception is this ability to know your the orientation of your body in space. So somebody throws a ball at you, you don't have to look at your hand and do this and catch the ball. It just happens automatically, or you hit a cricket ball or something or other. What wasn't understood was how we're sitting here now, but the muscle spindles in, say, our legs aren't sending a barrage of a length-tension relationship to our brains. If it did, our brains would be swamped. Something is down-tuning them or turning it off. So it's only things that are salient. If you're playing the guitar, the proprioception, your forearms is going back to your brain and being used, whereas the proprioception of information coming from your calf muscles aren't. And what wasn't understood was how you can change the gain, how you can change how different bits of information become more important in a certain situation over others.
Right.
So my PhD was about trying to find out that, and it turned out what happens is there are two substances that can be released onto the muscle spindle motor neuron, which is called a gamma motor neuron, and that's serotonin, which makes them more sensitive, and noradrenaline, which makes them less sensitive.
Hold on. So when you have more noradrenaline, you feel less of those signals, and when you have serotonin, you feel more of those signals
in the vicinity of the muscle spindle, the gamma motor neuron of the muscle spindle. So not generally,
right?
But that's essentially it. Yes, that's so if you were playing the piano or something, it happens in your spinal cord, the area of the spinal cord controlling your hands will have loads of serotonin squirted onto them, so that the information coming back from the muscles in your forearms are much more sensitive and much more acute, whereas the muscle spindles controlling the spinal cord, and the spinal cord controlling your thigh muscles have noradrenaline squirted on them, so that you don't.
Do you think that's because when you're playing the piano, your fingers, that's what you're focusing on? You're not like mindful of like your leg, and that's why you're not. That serotonin isn't sent there, or is it? Is it not
coming to the driving sort of analogy? Or imagine you're walking a tightrope. People who can walk a tightrope don't have to think about it. They just walk along all those strap things that people call. Then they don't have to think about it. But because the brain needs that information, the cerebellum and the basal ganglia and all these parts of the brain, it will happen automatically. So certainly in the initial stages when you're concentrating on something, that might be, but it happens automatically depending on
your brain gets used to the kind of stimulus of doing that thing, and then it knows where to kind of send that serotonin when you're in that situation.
If you're being chased by a grizzly bear, your brain knows that the information coming from your masseter muscle, that's your cheek that controls your jaw, isn't important.
Yeah.
It knows what's important is the information coming from your leg muscle, so you can run away from them.
That's another thing that really fascinated me when we looked at like the fight or flight response, is that literally it's the amygdala. It knows it can relate a grizzly bear to then fear and then an escape. Because a grizzly bear is really just, if you think about vision, it's just like light waves and the sounds just like that our ears are picking up. And yet there's a small almond-shaped part of our brain that knows that's a scary thing. And why does then looking at a flower not give me that
It's
that's
learned.
what blows my mind.
That's learned behaviour.
Even if you showed a baby a grizzly bear, it'd be scared, surely.
I don't think so.
Really?
No, I don't think so. So why are some people scared of little spiders?
Probably, yeah.
Why do people? If a spider came into the room now, I would want. Yeah. So they've learnt that behaviour off somebody else. So certainly that grizzly bear.
Aren't there some fears that they found to be innate though, like cliffs, like heights, and reptiles in the dark?
Yes, that's true. Those do seem to be innate, but things like spiders and snakes maybe. You seen that thing where they put a cucumber behind a cat?
Yeah.
I tried it with my cat. It didn't work at all. He just turned and looked at the cucumber like it was
cats are scared of some weird stuff.
Yeah, they are.
Isn't there also a thing where you can put them in a circle and they won't want to leave that circle? I saw that.
It's
so,
square.
You put them in is it a square?
You know how cats like boxes?
Yeah.
They just get into a box and they stay there. My cat doesn't do that, actually. He's not particularly interested. Well, they were trying to find out why they did that, and they found it seemed to be enclosures. So if they just marked a square out on the floor,
it's like territory,
the cat would come and I didn't read the full.
So would it move?
Only if it felt uncomfortable. But have you never done? Have you got cats?
I do.
Yeah, I've got two.
You get a bit of paper and you put it on your desk. What does the cat do? It jumps on onto your desk and sits on the bit of paper that you're. It's just a curious sort of thing. I don't know the reasoning behind it, but I should have read the paper. But
so what's happening in your brain when you're scared then?
Lots and lots of things. I mean, it would be difficult to if you're talking about the fight or flight response. The initial thing is usually visual information or sometimes auditory information. So when you hear something that scares you,
it's like in horror films. Sometimes you're scared before the jump scare comes, just because of the music.
Yes. Well, I used to in my tutorials. Have you seen that game where you have these four handles on this game and you hold it, and it goes beep beep beep. It gets quicker and quicker, and there's a flashing light as well. And then at a certain point, the green light goes red, and the last person to push the button on the thing gets an electric shock.
Oh wow!
Have you never? Oh well, it was a great. I used to play it in my tutorials, and just as a bit of an icebreaker in the first tutorials, and then give them electric shock. And I always won because I didn't look at the flashing light. Because the latency in visual information is much longer. It's got to go from your retina to your lateral geniculate nucleus to the primary visual cortex to the motion part, etc., the colour parts of the brain. Whereas the auditory information goes straight from your ear to the auditory part of the information, and it's a very short pathway. So I didn't used to look at the flashing light. I just listened to it, and when I heard the change in the tone, I knew to press my button, and I always won that sort of thing. So in answer to your question, so a visual or an auditory start will suddenly make you secrete adrenaline from your adrenal cortex. There are adrenal glands which sit just above your kidneys. And those nerves are called splanchnic nerves. So you suddenly get an impulse down to splanchnic nerves, which stimulate the adrenal cortex, make you release adrenaline. And adrenaline is a substance that primes you for fight or flight. It makes you metabolize carbohydrates in the form of glycogen in your muscles, which converts them into glucose to power your muscles. Your brain starts stopping doing things that are not essential, for example, digesting food, or even maintaining control of your bowels and your bladder. That's why people shit and piss themselves when they're really scared, because that's not important when you're trying to run away from people. It opens up your airways. It opens up your vocal cords so you can get more air in and out of your lungs, so you can provide oxygen. So you need to breathe more to power your muscles. It's an aerobic thing. So many different things are happening in the fight or flight response. Do you remember any of this stuff? All
that. And we looked at also like is it adrenocorticotropic hormones?
Oh yeah,
from the hypothalamus, and then all of that.
Yes, that's right. Yeah,
all that stuff.
That's right. Yeah.
But I want to ask you this, right?
Yes.
In our modern day, we often can sometimes get a fight or flight response when there isn't like a threat to our survival. Like every time I have to do a bit of public speaking, like the last year at school when I was part of the presidential team, and we'd have to do assemblies or everything. Suddenly, I'm getting this raised heart rate. I'm sweating. I've got a dry mouth. Like, why do you think that happens? Because I've got my theories, but why do you think we see public speaking, say, or social situations as a fear, like we would like a dangerous animal?
It's a complex thing. For some people, it would be the fear of being laughed at, being ridiculed, making a mess of something, and people laughing at you. People find that very stressful. We all want to be liked by our peers. So public speaking is this idea. I mean, I have a stutter. So when I was giving lectures, initially I used to be very, very scared because I think I'm going to make a stutter. People are going to laugh and what have you. And I was very fearful of it. So it is that fear of social acceptance.
And where do you think that comes from? Because why can't we just, if something goes wrong, everyone laughs at us, but why can't we just get on with our lives?
Some people have different levels of sensitivity to it. I know people who have no fear of standing up in front of people and talking, whereas I know other people who are so shy about being introvert, extrovert, and
do you think it could be maybe an evolutionary thing of like back in our past, because we relied on our tribe to survive, that we needed social validation, we needed acceptance from the group to even survive. So an idea of being ridiculed could then affect our survival.
Yeah, I think that's sounds like a reasonable hypothesis. I don't know how you test it, but it sounds like
Well, that's all the things with this evolutionary stuff. It's like, well, if we were in the wild, that's why.
Yeah. But the other thing is, of course, that our flight or fight responses, those systems were designed to. They equipped us to get away from danger, or to go out hunting and find meat and what have you, and that kind of stuff. Now we don't do that. We go to Sainsbury's and we get our food off the shelf or whatever. So I think sometimes that fight or flight response shifts in an inappropriate way to other things that we think that causes stress. So people who get anxiety, exam anxiety, what have you.
And that's crazy because that's just a bit of paper and a pen.
Some people will just get a bit of anxiety, like me. They get a bit nervous, they go into the exam, maybe the bit of adrenaline, it works in their favour and everything is okay because I've prepared. Other people will just go completely, they'll just melt down and be unable to have panic attacks and what have you. So I think the fight or flight response is great if you're running away from a grizzly bear, but you can't let it interfere with your life if it's something that isn't life-threatening. Otherwise, we know that we call that stress or anxiety or panic attacks.
Yeah, I've sort of learnt to kind of counter condition it with a different emotion. For me, it's like when I feel that my heart rate going, or I have to do a bit of public speaking, or when I used to do plays and stuff, I'd see that as this is showing that I care, this is showing that I'm excited, and this is showing that it's something I'll learn from and grow from. And yes, it's stressful, but like it's like a good stress.
Yes.
Rather than a bad stress, which just makes my life worse, you know.
Interestingly, when people have panic attacks, what tends to happen is initially they'll have the panic attack. There'll be some stressor that causes them a panic attack, and they will realise that the symptoms they had was a raised heart rate, heart beating in their chest, and raised breathing. But then they will associate afterwards a rapid heart rate with stress. So if they start to run and their heart rate goes up, they think I'm having a panic attack, and they trigger their own panic attack as a consequence. So they're inappropriately using those physical effects as an indication they're having a panic attack. And part of the way that I think some psychologists deal with it is trying to dissociate the physical with the mental. Yeah, you're having a rapid heart rate, but that doesn't mean you're having a panic attack. It means you're having a rapid heart rate.
Yeah.
And they try to dissociate the two, amongst other things. It's very complicated, and I'm no expert in that.
Wow. I want to go back to a bit of a point we said earlier about when people go into those states, like that guy driving his car in an epileptic fit unconsciously.
I think we call them seizures now. I don't think we're allowed to call them fits anymore. Yeah, I think it's called a seizure now. Yeah.
Right.
Anyway.
And this is quite a broad question, but I think it'd be a good springboard for a good discussion that we actually didn't touch on when I spoke to you the other day. We looked at a study during my psychology A level. We were looking at free will and determinism, and we looked at a study that found that areas of the motor cortex showed activity before someone was
yes.
consciously aware of like moving their finger or
Yes.
moving their hand. And what I wanted to ask you was, from your idea of how the brain operates, what's your stance on free will?
Okay, so there is a big group of people who say we don't have free will. Because the idea of having free will is that you can spontaneously make a decision to do something. I'm now making a decision, they will say, to pick up this glass of water and have a sip from it. That's my free will. Or even though, because I'm thirsty, I'm going to deny that so I can keep talking. Now, those people will say the problem is the electrical activity that makes me pick up the glass starts 10 seconds or so, or some people said up to a minute, before the actual activity is happening. So they're saying that something is making a decision, but not not the me. I found that a bit disturbing at first, because we all like to believe we have free will, and in fact, when you talk to some people of a religious persuasion, they don't like the idea that we don't have free will, because of course God gave us free will so that we can worship Him and all that kind of stuff. So anyway. I think the basic thing is you've got to decide what is I. What are you thinking is I? Is your subconscious not part of you? Is that not part of what makes your I, that makes you? I think it does. And therefore you can say we do have free will. It's just that we don't have that minute control over it from second to second to second.
Right.
Other people would argue, well, no, that's not the case at all. Free will is about being able to do whatever you want to do at any particular time. In that case, we don't have free will. Whereas from what I'm saying, and I'm sure there are, I don't know what those people are called who agree with me, it's the idea that your subconscious may be doing these things and planning beforehand in order to do them, but that's still part of you. It's your subconscious. It's just that you're not aware of it. In the same way, I'm not aware of my bowels now processing my lunch. I don't know what my guts are doing to the cheese on toast I had for lunch. Does that mean that it's not part of me? That function isn't part of what my brain function actually is?
That is your unconscious part of you then?
Yes, it has to be.
So yeah, because that's the thing. That's something that I think about. Like, am I my brain? Like, I know that sounds stupid, but like, it's kind of like what we were talking about the other day and that. So you would say everything about this organism, as well as my conscious experience, is me as well. So I am the function of my digestive system as well as my endocrine system. And
do you have free will over what your body does?
Yeah, because you can't decide to eat food and then not digest it. That happens. Do you know what I mean?
Well, that's because digestion is automatic.
So did I decide to do
control.
it?
But you do, because you eat the food.
You initiated it. In the way that petrol went into your carburetor of your car, it had no choice about combusting. It just happened because of the way the car is set up. You put food in your stomach, and the process of digestion actually starts. I actually had this conversation about whether the brain is the person or the seat of behaviour with a psychologist. Actually, we'd had a drunken night out, and we got very, very drunk, and she was very attractive, and we were sitting on the steps of City Hall, and we had this conversation. She was a social psychologist, and she said, the brain isn't me. It isn't necessarily me. And I said, well, there's one easy way of finding out. If I take out your brain, does your sense of I and your ability to behave stop? If I can keep your circulation and everything going, will it stop? And she thought about it, and I said, "It's obviously."
I agree with you with that, but where I'd push back is, let's say in the future we can create like robotic artificial bodies to then continue living, and then some doctor put my brain in a robotic body. It's not me anymore. Like, that isn't me. I don't think if you took my brain and put it in a robot, it would have my personality.
So we did touch on this. We talked about Descartes and the ghost in the machine and what have you, and dualism. And so I'm talking from a very dualistic point of view, which is actually not good. So the idea is that mind and body are the same thing. Brain, mind, and body are the same thing. So there's this idea called cognitive embodied cognition, which is the idea that it's not only our central nervous systems, our brain and spinal cord, that make us what we are, but it's also the peripheral nervous system, which you'll find in your fingers and your toes and your arms and what have you. All those things have some autonomy not much in humans that make us what we are. And the reason why this is interesting is I was reading about octopus. I've been reading a lot about octopus recently, and they have a very different arrangement of their central nervous systems in that, unlike us, they're not localized. So we have our localization of our central nervous systems in our head and our spinal cord, essentially. But octopus do have brains. It's a bit like it's a donut-shaped thing, and actually the mouth goes through the middle of it. It's a very strange arrangement. But then a lot of their nervous system is in their tentacles and their arms and their tentacles. Those are two different things. And it appears that the arms move completely independently of the brain. So if the octopus, imagine the octopus is looking away, one tentacle would be moving around, it'd find something it thought was food, it would investigate it, it would pull it through without conscious, say conscious, maybe that's the wrong word, but without the volition coming from the central nervous system. If you chop off an octopus's arm, it has less brain because the central nervous system is delocalized. So that means the octopus isn't the same creature that it was before in terms of its character, its personality, and its function because of the way it's arranged. I don't think you could say that for a human. If a human lost a leg in an accident, I don't think you could say that isn't the same person. That's because we're more localized.
Do you think if mine and Jacob's brain were put in robot bodies, we would have the same personality, though? Would it still be us?
Because our looks sort of have an effect on our personality.
But it would have, but no, I don't think so. I'm talking about kind of, I don't know, your memories will still be there. Like, would it be me? And that's the thing. That's the only way I could.
What makes you you? I think you just touched on it there.
Your body are just our meat vehicle.
That's how I usually see it. Yeah, but
you said memories,
experiences.
Have you ever met anybody with Alzheimer's or dementia?
I've never had anyone super close to me.
So I've met many people who've had dementia. I've watched their decline, and at a certain point, you think that is no longer that person because the thing that makes that person is their memories and their behaviour in relation to those memories.
Yeah,
and if they don't have those memories, they stop being that person. And you often meet people who've got a partner who has dementia, and they say, "I still love him or her. She looks the same. The body is the same, and everything." Or older. But it's not the same person. There's nothing in here in the head.
Yeah.
That makes that person, and it's gone. But they still feel the love for the body, for the animate, and so they carry on caring for that person.
And then that makes me think even deeper about is everything I do now driven by past memories that maybe I didn't choose?
Informed by,
right?
Rather than it could be driven in that if you were attacked by a grizzly bear, let's go back to the grizzly bear, I like that analogy. If you were attacked by a grizzly bear, if you saw another one, you'd think, oh shit, and you'd run, wouldn't you? So that is a drive rather than a volition.
I mean, my theory on free will is a kind of soft determinism, but free will within that. So I like to see it as, I use the analogy of a game. So I play wheelchair basketball, right? There are certain rules to that game, and if you don't follow the rules of that game, you're not playing that game.
Yeah.
So you can't do this to a certain player. You score 2 points if you're past this. This before this line, you get 3 points if you're past this line.
Yes.
You can't go out of this line because that's the court line. All these rules, right? Yeah. But within those rules, you can play the game in innumerable number of ways.
Yes.
To get the ball into the hole.
Yeah.
And I kind of see free will as that because I have certain constraints on me that I didn't choose in terms of where I live, who I was raised by, how my body functions, maybe the thoughts that I have, all of those things. I didn't choose those. So they're the rules of the game. And maybe, so within those rules, I can act as freely as I want, okay? But maybe also the way my brain operates is just like another rule of the game.
Yeah. So what is it that makes somebody be able to pick up a knife and stick it in somebody and kill them?
That's a good question.
Okay, if they're not being threatened, what if they're doing it for the insurance claim? What can make a normal person who goes to work every day, earns money and what have you, suddenly decide, could you say that wasn't their free will, that was the sum total of their experiences that made them do that?
I think you could argue that point, but then you could also argue the contrary. But I don't believe that you would do anything like that just to do it. Unless, yes, psychopaths exist, but
so not that brain chemistry though, isn't it?
I mean, we looked at how psychopaths have lower activity in their prefrontal cortex, which like emotional regulation is and things like that. But it's got to be. And is it their? That's the thing. Is it their fault? Is it your fault? Is it your fault that you're a psychopath because you're born with dysregulated prefrontal cortex, or you have higher amounts of dopamine in the limbic system, or like it's so hard to figure out.
But when you say is it their fault? The problem with the way we are is that we can't. That isn't the important thing. It's how do we stop them killing people?
Mm.
And what we do is we put them in regional secure units. That they are untreatable. There's nothing you can do for a psychopath. You basically incarcerate them for the rest of their lives. Can you say it's their fault? Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't have an answer to.
I don't think you can ever really.
I'd have a different answer to if they killed somebody who I love.
Exactly.
I might have a different answer.
Exactly, and then it would be lock and wait for the rest of the time. If it's someone close to you, when it's closer, you have that deeper connection to the situation. But yeah.
Familiar with Neuralink?
Oh, is this the Elon Musk thing? Yeah.
And he's trying to treat these memory disorders and reconnect like synapses or whatever. What do you think about it?
I have no idea. I look at him. He's a maverick. That's for sure. But we understand so little about brain function. I don't know how he can do this. I mean, you can almost think of it like stem cells. We don't really know a lot about well, we do know quite a bit about stem cells, but we don't know how to turn them into something useful all the time. And so he's talking about Neuralink and re-establishing these connections. The number of synapses in your brain is you have about 10 to the 14 connections in your brain. That's more than all the grains of sand on every beach on the planet. That's more than all the stars in the visible sky, in the visible universe. In fact, 10 to the 14. So how on earth is he going to be specific enough? How is his technology going to be specific enough to rewire those areas of the brain there, which we're talking about, the hippocampus for memory and the amygdala to an extent? How is he actually going to do that in any meaningful sort of? How is he going to re-establish it? I really don't know. I've not read about it because I think a lot of the cybernetic stuff there was some guy, I've forgotten his name now. He's a very famous is it Warwick? Or is that stupid? Yeah, I think he was a Professor Warwick somewhere. And he did this thing where he implanted a little thing into his forearm, a chip, so he could open the doors as he walked through his department. And he was claiming that was cybernetics. What the hell? It's just a bloody clicker in his arm. True cybernetics, this sort of interfacing our brain with technology, is really at its infancy. I believe they've got some. You can control. They've got some people who are in persistent vegetative states to control things via an MRI scanner or something or other, electrical signals. People who can't move, who are paralysed, can look at a dot on a screen and they can move it around with their brains. But that's about it at the moment. I think we're a long way.
Because that was a question I was going to ask. It's like, with your understanding of how the brain operates, do you think we'll ever get to a point where we can artificially replicate a human brain? Because I heard a guy called Naval Ravikant talk about this on Joe Rogan, where he said this idea that we're going to create robots just like us with brains just like us is stupid, because yes, you might be able to recreate neural connections, but there's also the depth of all the behavior of the organelles within the neurons and how different synapses can be reawakened when we don't use them, and they can be strengthened through practice. And it's like, how do you recreate those mechanisms? And as you've said, we still don't really understand how the brain works to some degree. So how are we going to completely replicate it?
If we do create artificial life, I think it will be very different in terms of its structure. Will be very different. Its brain structure will be very different to our brain structure, not out of choice, but because we don't know how our brains work. So, for example, funnily enough, I have my PhD thesis here.
Whoa!
I just found I found another version of it, and let me show you. Let me show you something. So,
Wow.
Let's see if I can find. Here it is. There's the picture. So this is a gamma motor neuron. Okay, this is the cell body of the gamma motor neuron, and this is one of the dendrites. And what you find is that the dendrite is very skinny, so the electrical impulse, the action potential, goes along here very quickly. But as the diameter of the dendrite increases, it will slow down. You know, a bit like a wave speeds up when it gets to a shallower part of the sea. It's the opposite thing here. So the information that's coming along here is zips along, comes all the way along here, and it starts to slow down as it gets wider and wider and wider. When it completely slows down, it depolarizes the cell body, and then the hillock of the axon produces action potential that go down. What we found in the PhD was that when we did the maths, we found you got to a point here where the action potential would go along, it would stop, it would fizzle a little bit there, and it could go back along the dendrite. This was a behaviour that we didn't.
We were told in biology that
only goes one way.
Goes in one direction. Yeah.
But in fact, because of this geometry, it will actually go along. As I say, it'll fizz a little bit, and it will go back along the other way. Now, that was great because one of the problems we have is a simple action potential going on and coming out of the other end means that we don't have enough complexity in the system to account for all the complex behaviors that we see in neural nets and humans and what have you. Whereas this adds another level of complexity, which may make it possible to do to explain some of the complexity that we actually see. But we weren't really investigating that. We're investigating something different. So I hope somebody else has had a look into that. But this is a very peculiar thing. So the action potential can actually go the other way depending on the geometry of the dendrite as it approaches the cell body.
Wow.
What is that? The activity going up and down?
I had to say that again.
What is it that's going up and down?
Well, it depends. This is a gamma motion neuron. So this is a thing that controls the sensitivity of the muscle spindle in this particular case. This is in the spinal cord.
But the action potential is like the electrical activity going through the neuron, and that's to do with like the passage of sodium ions, which are like charged differently, so they affect the charge, like electrical charge of that axon or that neuron, and that's how
it's literally an electrical blip. If I touch your finger, you get an electrical blip that goes along these axons to these dendrites that go all the way up here, up your arm to the spinal cord. They connect, they synapse with another one, and that goes up to the brain, and that's turned into touch information.
And that blew my mind when I learnt that just the responses of the nervous system is just to do with like the movement of differently charged like ions going through different
and it's passive
protein walls. Exactly,
it's a passive. That's the other thing that's really.
And how quickly it occurs. It's like I have a weird ass theory that like time to a molecule, there's just different levels because like. The amount that happens in a tiny split second for us. I mean, I know they're not conscious, but there must be some ridiculous different levels of time that go on. You know.
Well, and then when you look at quantum events, I mean, those time frames are even shorter. I mean, but it becomes meaningless in terms of unless the thing is conscious, if it's meaningless, really. Timing is of no great importance, really, and unless you're conscious of it. I mean, it is for the function of whatever. If it's a wave function collapsing in Schrodinger's wave equation, then that's one thing. Or the time it takes for a sodium ion to travel through the sodium channel and depolarize a membrane. Yeah, of course, but it doesn't really matter.
So you think any kind of theories that small molecules might be conscious are just bollocks?
I don't know. I hear this type of thing often through New Age people, you know, and you know, when you say, well, what do you mean by conscious? You end up in an argument where they try to define meanings of words, and you end up going round and round in circles because they say, well, no, by consciousness I mean, and I say, well, that's not what a scientist would say. And he says, yeah, man, but it's the vibrations in the crystals that make the consciousness. You know, and it becomes meaningless. It becomes really meaningless. You know, in order to talk about something in a meaningful way, we've all got to have definitions of stuff that are similar at least. And a lot of people try to make themselves appear clever by changing or claiming that this is what I mean by consciousness. Therefore,
and it's also, I think people don't like the idea that it's just your body just carries out processes because that's what it's wired to do, and that there doesn't have to be some weird conscious intervention where a sodium ion chooses to go through the protein channel.
Our egos are such that we like to give meaning to everything, but I think most biologists would probably agree that most life is pretty meaningless. There is no true meaning. It's just we're lucky that we're here. but we don't have any
I think
particular purpose.
we use meaning in order to deal with the existential anxiety of just
Yeah,
being human.
absolutely.
So we've created it.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. And as somebody, as a retiree who no longer has an important role in life, that existential angst suddenly increases, and you think, what the hell am I doing here? And you try and find meaning in other things. But I'm aware that I'm trying to find meaning in other things. So it becomes meaningless again. And it becomes a bit of a vicious circle, as it were. But yeah.
But so the only thing that is conscious is our brain. There's no cells or anything that all come together to build us.
Well, this is the thing about embodied cognition. Some people will say, yes, your peripheral nervous system and your body is part of what makes you conscious. Remember, your nerves aren't the only electrically excitable cells in your body. Your muscles are electrically excitable as well. So, are they doing something? Is that contributing to your level of consciousness? So, earlier you were talking about putting your brain into a robotic body. Would it be the same person? You said no, because your body is part of what makes you who you actually are, and you were sort of suggesting, and I would tend to agree as a dualist, that the brain is the most important thing. I think actually the answer lies somewhere in between, probably. That it would be a bit like going to sleep as a very fat person and waking up 6 months later and being slim and muscular. Well, you'd still be the same person, but you would probably behave in a different way because you're able to do things that you can do.
You'd have different character traits.
Yeah,
as well.
perhaps. Yes, perhaps.
If you were to kind of, I know it's quite a difficult question, but if you were to kind of think about it in percentages of what we understand about the brain and what proportion of like how the brain operates, where are we at? Do we know 5%? Do we know 50%?
Oh,
Is it
crikey.
under 1%? Is it, because I just to get a level of scale here for people to understand how much of a mystery our brain still is, even to this day.
I think it's one of those things where you investigate something, a certain, the vision scientists will look at, the way the visual cortex works, and it's a beautiful way, the way it actually works. And they'll think, right, we understand that. And then suddenly something will come up that will throw your understanding upside down on its head. And I think that's pretty much what keeps happening. You think you understand something, and then a different scenario appears that throws what you understand on its head. But that's what science is about. Scientists like not knowing. They like being confused, because that means I can investigate this. And science inexorably leads you to the truth, but maybe we don't get to that truth in a lifetime. Maybe it'll take many, many years to that. So I couldn't give you an answer to that. I can say we understand how the auditory part of the brain works pretty well, and we may understand, 30% of it, but then there'll be other things in there that we don't understand, that we simply cannot understand yet.
Do you think we'll ever get an idea of how consciousness emerged? Because that's the thing that baffles me, and I've listened to quite a few things about that, and where does it come from? They don't really know, do they? Or do you think they have an idea?
No. Well, the problem is we don't know what it is. So if we don't know what something is, how can we say where it came from, and how can we? It's the defining of it that's.
I mean, how would you define consciousness then? Do you think?
I wouldn't. I mean, some people will say it's that self-awareness, it's that awareness of self, and awareness of self in context with everything around it. That's one definition, but somebody else will come up with a different. There are many, many different forms of definition of what consciousness is, but I think the idea of self has got to be pretty fundamental to it, until you talk to people who are into things like Zen Buddhism and what have you, where they say there is no self, there is no I, and the first stage of awakening is this loss of self identity. Also, people who take certain drugs like psilocybin and LSD, when they're having their trips, they feel like they've lost this feeling of self, and that everything is connected to each other, which is pretty much what the what meditators talk about. What does it mean? I have no idea. I think it's an altered state of consciousness. I don't think it's anything spiritual. I think it's just a certain way of looking at things. It's
altered brain chemistry. Yeah,
I think it probably is.
How much of our body do we understand? Because that seems more sort of right and wrong answers.
Well, again, it depends which part of the body you mean. I mean, we know a lot about how the kidney works and how it filters the blood and what have you. We know an awful lot about that.
But there's still some mysteries.
There will be, yeah. Otherwise, we'd have all the answers and we'd be working towards therapeutics for diseases. So there's still a hell of a long way to go. And you have to remember that most science these days is geared towards, they call it translational science, which means that you're doing research in order to cure a disease, or you're doing research in order to make more efficient solar cells so that we can save the planet and what have you. And that's very, very good. It's really good for humanity. But sometimes interesting things come out of science that isn't specific to cure a disease or to make better solar cells or whatever. Sometimes doing science for the sake of it produces interesting stuff, but our governments decide not to fund that group of research because they want to say, we gave these group of scientists so many £1 million and they came up with a cure for this disease. Vote for us again. They don't want to fund some guy in a shed who's doing a bit of scientific research, just for the sake of a bit of scientific research, who might stumble on something fundamental, which is the way it was years and years ago. So I think that's part of the problem with science, is that we've lost that sort of Heath Robinson just doing science for the sake of science. It has to be research in order to get to a certain place that will benefit humanity directly, rather than indirectly, as a lot of research was years and years ago.
I want to ask you, kind of as a neuroscientist, what is your inclination on the root cause of kind of mental health problems and then maybe good mental health states also? Do you think it is pretty much a product of our biology to regulation of certain brain chemicals and the abnormalities in certain brain structures, or is it more an environmental thing, how you feel, or is it a combination of the two? So am I influenced to act how I do because of my brain chemistry, and then that becomes a kind of perpetuating cycle of I feel better, I do other things, or is it the opposite of that in terms of something happens, then that changes my brain, and that thing happens, I can continue to do that behavior. What is your stance on that in terms of what influences mental health generally?
So I guess as a neuroscientist, I would have to say that I lean on the biomedical model of brain and behavior, whereas the girl who I sat with on the steps of the city hall, she would have been the opposite. She would have suggested that it's environment and stuff that make us do certain things. Whenever there's a dichotomy, you can almost guarantee the answer is somewhere in between.
It's a dichotomy, sorry.
If there's a two completely opposing ideas of how something works, it's the brain, no, it's social conditioning. You can guarantee it's a bit of both.
Okay.
Yeah,
always it seems to be.
I thought that would be the answers you'd come to, is that it's a relationship between the two, like that.
I think it has to
a
be.
model that we looked at a lot, you'll definitely know, is like diathesis stress.
Yeah.
Where like you have a vulnerability to something, maybe it's genetic, maybe it's neurochemistry, but a stressor in your life or a social factor then triggers that to manifest, and then you have the problem.
So that's epigenetics as well.
Yeah. That stuff blew my mind when we looked at that in biology. When Jacob, what epigenetics is like changes to how your DNA functions without changing like the base sequence of the DNA, without changing the code itself. It's more like how the code behaves. So whether certain areas of the code are expressed or not, whether they become the protein.
So it's expression.
Yeah. So and we looked at a study on, I think it was mice, where they really stressed a mouse, and then they found that the children of that mouse would experience the same stress without having the past experience that the mother had had. So they wouldn't have to go through that trauma, and yet they still showed the trauma symptoms.
So these mice shook when they were scared. They shook. So they stressed them and they shook, and the children shook even without the presence of the stressor being initially.
And then it's like, can you inherit trauma? Can you, like, all of that?
But with DNA, so it can change itself.
So I think, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I'm just going to go on a tangent.
Yep.
We were told it was to do with other chemical structures like binding to the DNA. So you had methyl groups that would bind to the DNA, and then that would decrease the expression because it kind of the DNA is wrapped around proteins called histones already, and then when methyl groups bind, the proteins kind of more associate with each other. They kind of scrunch up closer together so that the DNA bases and like transcription factors which cause DNA to be expressed can't then attach. And then you have I think it was acetyl groups that do the opposite. They kind of spread the DNA out more so it can be expressed more. So it's not just to do with what DNA code you have, it's also how it behaves. And they were looking at how that can be kind of inherited. Unreal stuff. It blew my mind.
Just to explain it in a really basic sort of, because I know you're not from a scientific background, but your DNA is basically a code. And this code tells your body which amino acid to produce and string to another amino acid that brings it to it.
Yeah.
It makes a long string of amino acids. These amino acids then fold up. We call that a protein. So that protein could be insulin. It could be an enzyme in your salivary amylase. It could be anything. We're made up of that. The DNA is supposed to be constant, but it's susceptible to mutation. So each time a cell divides, the DNA comes out of the nucleus, it's translated into RNA, and then the precious DNA is put back into the nucleus, and we use the RNA to actually make the proteins. The problem is, in this translation, sometimes you can get errors. So there's only 4 things: A, C, G, and E. I can't remember arginine, cytosine,
ATG, and
thiamine, and I can't remember. It's been a long time. Sometimes those can change around, or the RNA can, the strands can cross over like this, and then they can splice in and change the position of everything. That's called mutation, and that's a normal part of a normal part of the procedure to produce variation in biological systems.
That's the theory of how everything evolved, is that things had genetic mutations, then changed a feature, and then when that feature was advantageous in the environment, those organisms survived.
When you say like, who am I, could a part of you just be your DNA?
Well, you are, if you're a materialist scientific thinker, you just say that yes, everything you are is created from your DNA because that's how you came to be. But what's also interesting is that I've told you about this before, that they found that when you have new experiences, it turns on new genes, which creates new proteins. So are parts of you within you that need to be unlocked through experience and weird things like that.
Yeah, so I mean, an obvious example is that if you got your finger and you had a rough surface and you rubbed your finger on the rough surface over and over and over and over and over and over, eventually you develop a callus on there. And a callus is just the accumulation of you will start producing more skin cells that will become thicker and thicker. Skin cells are dead, but it'll produce more and more until you get a callus on there. So your behavior has produced a physical change in you. Or a more obvious one is if you're learning a new language, as you're learning the vocabulary and what have you, and the grammar and what have you, your brain will actually rewire itself. It will get other connections, and those connections are all controlled by genetic factors. They'll produce those connections so that you can speak that language.
Because I asked Joel like a couple of weeks ago, why does learning a language mean that you are less likely to get memory disorders? So it's because you're using them again.
Well, yeah, the idea is that the plasticity of the brain is maintained. You're doing complicated things, and learning a language is a complicated thing. That just it's like use it or lose it. Don't use it or lose it. If you don't use a muscle, it'll atrophy and get smaller and smaller. If you go to the gym and you use a dumbbell, you'll get your muscles will stay. So it's a similar sort of thing. So people used to do little puzzles, didn't they, like Sudoku and stuff, because they believed in crosswords. Because they believed it would keep their brains fit and healthy, and it probably does, but it probably makes you good at Sudoku.
Yeah, that's what they found, is you get that skill. But the one thing they found that preserves cognitive function is exercise, because
that's right. Yeah,
maintains the ability for the brain to be oxygenated.
But I was going to say they don't know whether that's just because of good blood flow.
Do you think it could be something else, or?
Yeah, possibly.
What do you think?
I don't know. One of the things that I used to get my students to do essays on, so they did all the boring research for me, was exercise and a pill. Have you heard of this? So what they found is that when you do exercise, you certain factors are produced, certain chemicals are produced, certain hormones and stuff, and they're now looking towards, and in fact they have found that they're working on producing a pill that will produce the same effects as exercise, so you won't have to exercise.
But that's bad, isn't it? That's
Not if you're in a
How would
wheelchair.
that pill work, though?
Not if you're in a
It will
wheelchair.
basically it will release like the endorphins and things in your brain. I imagine that you get during exercise.
Other factors, not just endorphins, but other things that make so. But if you're a wheelchair,
I guess if you can't exercise, yeah, it's amazing. But do you think people will just exploit that? And
Well, if you're-
I'll
if-
take the pill.
if you're obese and you're not going to lose weight, is it better to give that person exercise and a pill so that they don't
Moral
contribute?
dilemma. Yeah.
I think it's perfectly fine. You don't want that person to have a heart attack or
No.
stroke or cancer. You want, even though you can say to them, "You've got to lose weight. Don't eat that pizza. Go and exercise." People don't do it. People just don't do it. So, is making the availability of a pill like that a good thing? I think it has to be in terms of societal issues.
They won't lose the weight. They'll just gain the benefits from the exercise.
They'll gain the benefits of exercise without having to do exercise.
That's not that. I just there's something I don't like. How like the extreme convenience of that it scares me slightly. Like convenience is good, but only like to a certain degree. Do you know what I mean? But I guess I can
I
understand.
think you're making a moral judgment here.
I think I am. I think you're right. I can totally understand the extreme cases.
You don't like fat people like me, do you?
Well, I've got nothing against.
That's how it starts. Some of my best friends are fat.
I've got nothing against someone being overweight and being happy with that. That's absolutely fine. But it just feels like this. It's not the moral thing of being fat is bad. It's the moral thing of I'm going to get the benefits of doing something difficult without having to do the difficult thing. You know, it's like when I leave the gym and I feel good, it's because I've earned it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do know exactly what you mean.
Just take how I feel after a workout as a pill. It's something greasy about that.
People probably exploit it though.
Yeah, it's like you could overdose on exercise pills. You know what I mean?
Well, I don't know. Presumably you could, but originally anabolic steroids were made to treat illnesses, and then eventually
exactly, and that's a great example.
What sort of illnesses?
So certain muscle wasting conditions and Paget's disease as a bone disorder, they gave anabolic steroids. So they were around for treating conditions, but of course people found it makes your muscles big, therefore bodybuilding became a real sort of issue. Everything is open to exploitation, but does that mean you deprive those people who can get a benefit? Do you deprive people who have muscle wasting diseases of anabolic steroids just because Arnold Schwarzenegger took anabolic steroids in the 70s? And I was watching Predator last night, actually, great film. But you can't make that moral judgment. Humans, the very nature of humanity is that they will use it to in some sort of exploitative way.
Yeah, interesting.
And I think if somebody is you see somebody waddling down the street and you think if they could take an exercise pill and get all the benefits of exercise, who am I to say that they shouldn't be allowed to have that?
But who is to say they are? Like who like someone's going to make a value judgment, someone's going to make a moral judgment here.
And I would say, would you deny somebody who was potentially going to die of a heart attack?
Of course not, because
so you've made the decision there. You would give them the pill.
Oh, it's difficult. I'm glad I don't have to make that decision. I'm glad it's
unfortunately, that decision is usually made by economics.
Yeah.
So, for example, I have diabetes. I was on a drug called semaglutide. I don't know whether you've heard of. So it's a drug that improves insulin production and glucose handling and what have you, and it makes diabetics a lot better. A side effect of it is it makes you lose weight. So you lose weight, which improves the diabetes, but it markedly makes you lose weight. It suppresses your appetite. It's you don't want to eat as much, and what have you. So what's happening is human nature. The Kardashians. What was that?
Weight loss tool now.
Yeah, who's the one with the big backside?
Kim Kardashian.
Kim Kardashian. She took it so she could get
very polite big backside.
Well, I have to watch it. I'm being recorded. She took it so she could get into a dress.
Yeah, man.
Elon Musk took it because he was getting fat, so he didn't look so.
Yeah, he's actually looking better now.
Because he took some.
But I think he does running as well.
But the consequence of that is that I can't get semaglutide now.
Because it's been banned because people are using it.
No, because they're using it all. So all the fatties in America and the UK as well. Remember, the UK is there's a second obesity. They're using semaglutide So when I went to my doctors the other day and said, "Why haven't you prescribed me
Hold on, so
semaglutide?"
they now, like, doctors now prescribe that drug for people just if they're over 8. They don't even need to have
There
diabetes.
are certain clinics that will do that, and they'll only allow you to have it. I think it's for 2 years,
Wow.
but people will buy it privately. If
Yeah.
you're a billionaire,
Yeah.
you can get anything.
Mm.
Not even you're a
Didn't you
billionaire.
say the UK is the second most obese country in the world?
Mm,
Mm.
One in how many?
I don't know. Is it 1 in 4 or something?
Yeah,
Is
Mental.
I think
it's
America's nearly 1 in 2.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me in the slightest. So I can't get semaglutide. Now, I need it for a clinical reason.
Mm.
I need it because without it, my diabetes has poor control, and that will potentially make me go blind and lose a leg and have a heart attack and die. I can't get that because fat people are using it. Well, that's
Yeah.
essentially what it is.
Should fat people be able to go to a clinic and get all the weight cut off them?
I've got a sword. I could do that for them. Japanese swordsmanship.
Do that.
Yeah, but
Well, because you told me last week that you believe people are destined to become more cynical and less optimistic as they get older. So, firstly,
Oh.
I'd like you to expand a bit more for the listeners and for Jacob why you think that is. And also, why do you think me and Jacob then have this youthful, naive optimism that's destined to die?
Well, you've given me that. You've given the answer there. It's youth. As you get older, for some reason, you tend to become more cynical. Some people would say you become more cynical because out of experience. You see, when you're young, you see one person who steals your girlfriend,
Yeah.
and you think, "Oh, sounded like it." Sometimes it sounds like he's
No, he was the one that stole it.
yeah, they steal your girlfriend, and you think, "Oh God, that's awful. They've stolen my girlfriend." And then you get older, and you think you see other people as a bit of a threat, and you think because of past experience, maybe it's that you become more cynical about life. You begin to sort of think that human nature is not as altruistic and as good as you originally thought when you were young. People also, interestingly, seem to become more right wing as they get older. I mean, I think I told you about my friend who was actually a communist when he was a young cosmologist. He'll be able to identify himself from that now if he listens to this. So he was a cosmologist who did his PhD with Stephen Hawking, and he's a really bright guy. And when I speak to him now, it's surprisingly how right wing he's become.
To that, do you think there is a clear link between cynicism and being right wing? Because maybe if you're an optimist, you're more likely to be left wing because you're like, yeah, we can improve the world, we can improve the systems that we have here. Everyone can be equal, everyone can have an equal opportunity and an equal experience in life. But the right wingers say, no, we are not. We it's every man for themselves. Pull yourself up by the bootstrap, get on with it.
I mean, anecdotally, that would appear to be the case, but I wouldn't put any scientific basis on that. Somebody would have to do. I'm sure they have. I'm sure somebody has done that. So you're saying that if you're less cynical, you're a lot more likely to be socialist? Is that sort of what you're saying?
Probably, yeah.
The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, as Mr. Spock said. Or if you're more right wing, you're more likely to say, well, I've got here through hard work, and I'm not giving my wealth or my what I've earned to anybody else until they've earned it themselves. I don't know. It's an attractive thought. It makes things very, very simple, but I don't really think it works in that way. So what you need to say, you need to find an altruistic right-wing person, or you need to find a very selfish left-wing person. I'm sure they exist. Yeah. So that sort of throws that onto its. I think that probably turns that idea onto its head. But you certainly do become. And when I see young chaps like you, I sort of think, yeah, I used to be like that. I used to be really idealistic, and it was nice and. But I'm not like that anymore because of experience. And then I realised, no, I'm actually quite cynical now. And is it through experience of life and learning that people don't help you out unless there's something in it for them?
Does that mean you have to be cynical? Does that mean you have to? Do you know what I mean? Like I'm thinking like we have to necessarily repress things to function in the world. We can't really comprehend the complexity of everything. We can't really comprehend the suffering going on. So if that's necessary, if we have to live in our own little fragment of the world that might not really reflect true reality, then why not pick one that's optimistic? Why not go out with the belief that things are going to be all right for me?
I think cynicism is probably an evolutionary thing. if you're cynical and untrusting of people and believe, and you look after yourself and you look after your genetic progeny, that's probably an evolutionary thing, so that you get the survival of your genetic information. So I wonder whether it is actually an evolutionary.
I guess if you think about it, we're all around the campfire, right? Everyone's cynical apart from one guy. There's a rustle in the bushes, right? Everyone goes, that could be something dangerous. We should probably prepare. We should probably get out of here. And the other guy goes, nah, it's probably, probably nothing. And then a tiger jumps out and eats him. You know what I mean?
And we all laugh.
Yeah.
Or you're sitting around the campfire and somebody's got what are those cigarettes with cannabis in them called? What is it?
Spliff.
Yeah.
Joint.
I've never seen these things in my life. So you're all sitting around a campfire. You've got a spliff and you're passing it around, and then one guy hogs it.
Yeah.
Is it called hogging the doobie? I believe something like that. And and you all sit around and you think, you fucking pass it on. You've had it for 5. You're not even smoking it. You're just holding it in your hand. So is that lack of awareness that person has? Look, I've got this spliff. It's a finite resource. There are 12 of us here. We all want to spread our herpes around on the end of this cigarette. Is that something particularly? Whereas I don't know, if you and I had a spliff, we'd think, okay, you'd pass it on. But there's always one bastard who will hold on to it. That's a selfish sort of, but. It's good. It's good for them because they get the pleasure of having several tokes on the doobie.
Yeah, but I wouldn't say the doobie hogger is. I wouldn't say he's the epitome of optimism, though.
I've never heard that. Oh, a doobie what?
Doobie hogger.
Doobie hogger.
No, that's your term. You said hogging.
Did I say that?
You said he's hogging the doobie.
Oh, I didn't. Okay, I didn't. But I didn't change it the other way around.
I don't think the doobie hogger is the epitome of optimism, though. I guess that
No, when I'm talking about cynical, I was sort of saying that optimism maybe isn't a good thing to have in terms of genetic survival, because that optimism will say, okay, that was about smoking cannabis. What if he was your hunting partner and he's the guy who, when the tiger turns around to attack you, or the wildebeest or the grizzly bear turn around to attack you, he's going to say, fuck that, I can run faster than him, I'm going to get away, it's going to eat him. Optimism is probably not a good thing in that place, thinking he'll look after me, he's my wingman, unless you've got a really good friend who you trust implicitly. So this optimism for everybody. So
it makes you vulnerable to being let down.
Possibly.
Yeah, because that's something that I was at the pub on Tuesday with a couple of my friends, and I said to one of them, I was like, give me one piece of constructive criticism. I don't care what it is, I'll accept it. He goes, you're too naive. He says, you're way too happy. He says, all these ideas and dreams that you have, Joel, what will happen if they come crashing down? That was the one thing he said. And it made me think, yes, okay, maybe my optimism makes me vulnerable to being let down, but I think I would rather pay that price than the contrary and just be like, well,
what do you get out of being optimistic, though?
I'm not nihilistic. I actually want to take action. I want to do things. I want to be here today. If I didn't think that things would work out positively for me, I wouldn't be sat here today. I'd just be like, well, what's the point? I'll just sit on video games and eat What's-its.
You'd have great fun, though.
I wouldn't, though. I don't think.
It's great fun.
For a bit. For a bit, though.
It's not fulfilling.
Try and play Fortnite and eat What's-its for 8 hours straight. Afterwards, you will not feel good.
Yeah. No, I can see where I would say ignore him and continue the way you want.
Yeah, but it was good. It was good that he gave me that, and I was like, I do agree with you. I am vulnerable to being let down, and there might come a point when I'm 30 and I go, oh, what did I want at 18? I'm nowhere near there. But I'd rather pay that price for how it benefits me now. It's kind of like, I actually wrote it in a little like newsletter that I write each week. I wrote it, and I think it's similar to my belief in God, right? I don't care that there's no concrete proof that God exists or not. My life benefits because I believe in God. And that's what matters. So the world might not be as happy as I believe it is, and it might not work out for me, and it might not go right, but my life still benefits because I believe that to be the case.
So as a cynical person, I would say I'm glad you believe in God, and I'm glad you believe that because it benefits me. You're going to be nice.
Exactly.
You're going to be nice to other people, and I'm going to exploit you at some point. At some point, I'm going to exploit your good nature and steal your computer or whatever. Or when you become famous, I'll tell everybody you're a Nazi when off camera or something. So this is the issue. Was it Karl Marx who said that? religion is the opium of the masses. It allows people to live in a deluded state, but it's great
Mm,
because they stay happy. I'm poor, I'm working all the time, but God has a plan
mm,
for me. Whereas the oligarchs say, "Yeah, you keep on working, you bastard. You make the money for me,"
mm.
and they exploit that. And this is the problem. We live in a world of potential people to be exploited and those who do the exploiting. And I would say that the exploiters are cynical, and those who tend to get exploited are those who are a little bit optimistic. Complete
It's
generalization.
true.
It's a generalization. It's not always true, but
Mm. Well,
you
Jacob was
can
a big,
see.
big fan of the book, The 48 Laws of Power.
Yeah.
Oh,
That
wait
links
a
to
minute.
a lot of that kind of thing, isn't it? Of like, there's a chapter
How?
on it, it's like make people do the work for you and take the credit,
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's Darwinism, isn't it? I guess working at its best, in that evolution, nature is red in tooth and claw. Who was it who said that? One of Darwin's contemporaries. And it is that dog eat dog sort of world. But you don't want to live in a Darwinist world because it's bloody awful. We do live in a Darwinist world, but you don't want to live in a socially Darwinism society because it's bloody awful. Because you're looking at your back looking over your shoulder all the
So
time.
don't we to some degree live in a kind of Darwinist social environment? In fact, in
Yes,
the
we
way that
do.
we live in hierarchies, and there are people you
Yeah.
can see that benefit more than
Yes, if you
others.
don't work hard enough, you will be sacked from your
Mm.
job because you're not surviving in that particular situation. Absolutely. But when it becomes extreme, so when Margaret Thatcher said, or I think it was a Home Secretary said, "Get on your bike and find a job." In other words, if you live in the South, you have to go to Scotland to find a job and leave your family behind. It starts becoming cruel. There's a certain cruelty to it. It's good for the survival of the whole,
Mm.
but for the individual, I think it's really not a very nice
No, I
situation.
completely agree.
No matter what the system, there's always going to be someone that exploits, surely.
Yes, but then there's a way of exploiting. So, for example, I heard the other day that Beyonce and Taylor Swift. Have you heard what they've done recently? So Taylor Swift has given all of her people who are working on her tour huge bonus. She said, "Look, I've made millions out of this tour. I'm going to give several million to these people." She's given them huge bonuses. Beyonce actually gave money to all those businesses around the venue that have had to work harder to get fans into her thing. She said, "All these people are coming, eating in these restaurants and bars and making them really busy, and these poor people are having to work harder. I'm going to compensate them for that by giving them money." And they're all saying there was a Nigerian restaurant, and the owner was saying, "It's fantastic, we were working our backsides off doing this, and yet." Then we suddenly got a thing saying, "I'm going to give you £50,000 towards your business." I mean, that is so. These people are at the top of their game, potentially able to exploit everybody and underneath them to make more money. But what do? They decide to behave in a different way and give money to those people who are underneath them.
I mean,
So that is special.
But
it could just
that also will boost them up in the hierarchy
Yes.
because it will make them.
Okay. Yes. That's true. If they hadn't mentioned it,
Mm.
and we somehow heard about it, then that would have been a fantastic thing. But people do charitable work without talking about it. People
Yeah,
work in soup kitchens without. So there is a lot of people. There are a lot of people around who are altruistic in that way, and they do it because
some of
they
it's
say
just
it's
good
good.
for their image.
I mean, it could be that, but nevertheless, they are giving money away. I mean, it's still the effect is positive, even if the intent is maybe a
Yeah.
little.
definitely. And I think it's hard to do anything charitable without a little bit of
Yeah.
how you're going to benefit yourself.
Do you ever watch Friends?
No, no.
Oh, it's another one you got to watch. There's an episode in there where one of the guys in there is trying to do an altruistic act. His friend Phoebe says there is no such thing as an altruistic. And every time he does something positive, she points out why it's not an altruistic act, and it's almost impossible.
Mm.
There will always be some, even if it is just. I think in the end he does something which has no benefit, and she says, "Do you feel good about that?" And he says, "Yeah, I do." And he says, "Not an altruistic act then, because you've got something out of it, the feeling of well-being."
For a cynical person, do you not think it'd be nice to just give and take, and I'll do this for you, and come and help me, and then we'll both be happy?
Yeah, I mean that's the ideal. That's. I mean, I guess that's communism, isn't it? I guess in the
Mm.
ideal world, that's the Marxist sort of state that you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. It's when people want their back scratching more than what they're giving back.
And
People
I
get
think,
greedy.
and I think that's why it can never really work with the state of the world is now because people are inherently greedy, and also we have differences in you know,
ability.
the card that we're dealt in life and our intelligence and
But again, greed is evolutionary.
yeah, 100%. And if you were
You'll
greedy
keep
back
as
in the day,
many
you're going to
resources as you can,
survive.
so
Yeah.
you'll survive and your genetic material will survive. I can always argue a point back to evolution. It's it's one of the best ideas we've ever had, I think. You can always argue back to an evolutionary state. You can always work it. I used to tell my students to do the same thing. If you have a problem in neuroscience, try and think of it in evolutionary terms, and you can usually work out how it actually works. So yeah.
Yeah, and it helps to have that understanding also in yourself as well, why you do certain things, why you think certain things, why you have certain drives. When you realize, oh, I am an organism in some grand system, it's like, okay, you know, not that it absolves the responsibility on you, but I want to talk about your Japanese swordsmanship.
Oh right, okay.
Because it's interesting. Never met anyone that does anything like that. Firstly, I want to ask, why have you maintained that practice? I mean, how many years have you been doing that for?
A Japanese swordsmanship
Yeah.
since well, I started in the 80s originally, and then had a bit of a break for university and what have you, and then
Mm.
restarted in the noughties.
Right. Okay.
So a long time.
So, why have you maintained that practice as long as you have? And what is the utility and the benefit for you of a martial art?
So originally, I started martial arts when I was 12 years old. I started with, well, actually, no, 7 with judo, but every kid did judo in those days. So karate at 12 years old. And it was just like any other kid. I wanted to be able to evade the bullies, beat them up, and become the hero, and then get the girl at the end of the day. I guess. And then as you started studying the martial arts, being a bit of a cerebral person, you start looking at Japanese culture, because it was Japanese martial arts I was doing. You look at Japanese culture, you look at Zen, you look at all these other things, and it started changing the way I saw life and the way I saw morality and other people, all that kind of stuff.
What kind of things changed?
Well, it's difficult to know because I don't know how I would have been without that. I always say that I think the martial arts, the word for martial arts in Japanese is Budo. I think Budo has had the most profound effect on my life than anything else, beyond the effects of my parents, of my educational system, of my brother, who I was very close to, and what have you. I think it's had the most profound change on me um, in my whole life. But I couldn't tell you what I would be if I didn't have that. I guess I'd be like another academic who doesn't have martial arts in their life. So it's
Mm.
difficult to say because I can't take it out of my life and see how I
So,
would have.
but what do you think it provided if you had to explain to someone, like someone's thinking about doing it, thinking about like on that time scale that you have, why should they commit to this thing for 20 plus years?
Well, you could commit yourself to playing TV games. What's that going to get you? A video game. It'll give you pleasure. It'll give you certain skills. It'll give you repetitive strain injury in your thumbs and what have you. But it will give you something.
Mm.
But I think the benefits of doing a martial art, something that's so anachronistic, it's so out of place, especially swordsmanship. Who carries a sword around anymore? When I did karate and what have you, it was great because I could self defense, or I could take part in a demonstration or something or other to recruit more people. But doing something that is of no use, it has its own benefit. I do bell ringing. I've started doing bell ringing at Cockington Church, which is just over there.
What's bell ringing?
In a church when they ring the bells.
Oh, so they get
Yeah, yeah. So there's a group of us a bit. So I've only just started. I'm by no means adept in any way, and I'm thinking, what the hell am I doing this for? And it's just something a little bit unusual. It's not playing football. It's not collecting stamps. It's just a bit different, and I think that just gives you something that maybe you can talk about to somebody in a pub or something or other. As though being a neuroscientist isn't enough. It usually stops the conversation dead when you say you used to do that. Nobody wants. You go, oh right, okay. But perhaps that's what it is. It just makes me think I'm a little bit more interesting. Maybe that's what it is.
Right.
Maybe that's what it is. That's not a very nice reason to do something.
No,
But
I think that's why a lot of people do what they do.
I think a lot of people do it as another form of religion. There's a moral aspect to all of that, and
You don't fight others with the swords, do you? It's
no,
technique and
yes, it's
certain
solo
moves and
kata,
things.
yes, but I used to do kendo where you do fight with other people, and that's using bamboo swords. Um, but the problem is when you have a competitive edge to anything, I think it brings out the worst in people. So the whole point of the martial arts is about of Budo is about self-development and making you a better person and a better character. Having said that, some of the most odious people I've met in my life have been martial artists.
Mm.
What does odious mean?
Odious, horrible, disgusting, somebody you don't really want to know. It makes them, it makes a lot of people that. In fact, I would even go as far as to say that a lot of martial artists are the most odious sort of people, except, and I think competition and trying to defeat somebody so you can get a nice shiny medal brings out the worst in people. I used to do, when I was at university, I used to study sports science, and the I was a physiologist doing a sports science module, and the other students on the sports science module were the most horrible people you'd ever meet because they were competitive, and they were always trying to outdo each other, and they wouldn't help each other. There was no. I remember once going to the library to find a sports science journal to read a particular article, and I found somebody had ripped it out of the book. And I suspect. So I went to see the head of department, and they said, "Yeah, people do this so that other people can't read the papers,
Wow.
so that they can't get the benefits." They were ripping out, or they were ripping out some of the pages, the last bit of the conclusion of the paper.
So do you think?
I'm sure it goes on in other disciplines. I'm sure it's not just sports science, but they were very horribly competitive people. And then you see athletes who, they will not go to their parents' a relation's funeral because they have a competition, or their families suffer. They don't get their company because they're training or they're in a training period.
Mm,
And I know they win prize money and it goes towards the family, but it seems to be a very selfish
yeah.
sort of thing to do.
Do you think then competition is what really activates our ego?
Yes,
Mm,
I think it absolutely is.
yeah.
I think it's a terrible thing, and I think in the martial arts it's a really bad thing because that's not what the martial arts is about. But of course, it's the thing that attracts people. They can fight in us, with their swords and with the bamboo swords, and they can win a medal and become the world champion or whatever. And humans are competitive. That's part of the Darwinian thing.
Mm,
But sometimes you sort of think you should transgress that sort of. You should be able to go above your primal responses. A lot of us would love to watch gladiators fighting to the death, but we don't. We
mm.
we rise above that because we know it's a morally wrong thing. Mind you, we watched MMA. Crikey, some of that's.
UFC.
I love it. I have to admit, I really enjoy watching people beat the crap out of each other. But
I do completely agree with you, but I also do think there's a lot of use in losing in terms of competition. Like, yes, it inflates our ego and winning can be dangerous and sacrificing every other part of your life isn't good. But taking a big loss can be very healthy in terms of like an ego check in a way.
well, you're talking to somebody who's just made a huge loss. I attempted my fifth Dan the weekend before last,
Mm,
and I failed. And I'm finding it very difficult to come to terms with
mm,
it. And my first thought is I want to give it up. I'm not going to continue. I'm just going to give it up, and that's my ego. That's my pathetic, childish ego
mm,
spitting out my dummy. I've contacted my teacher in Truro, and I've said, "Look, this is the way I feel about it." He says, "Look, everybody said you only just failed. It was only just this couple of things, which makes me feel worse. You've got to come back. We'll do it again in Switzerland in April. Everything is a much better environment. Blah blah blah." But there's that ego part of me, and I do have a huge ego, which is why I don't do competition, because the thought of losing would make me murderous.
mm,
So I've avoided competition all of my life because the thought of losing or actually losing would bring out the absolute worst in me.
mm,
So by avoiding competition, except competition with myself, which in some ways a grading actually is, I'm not competing with anybody else. I'm trying to get that particular fifth Dan myself, and it's a competition myself. But I failed, and it's been a really difficult couple of weeks for me, to the point that I've just basically hidden away from everybody else.
mm.
But and then that made me think: what about people who train for the Olympics, who train for an event, and they train for 50 or all their adult lives for 100 meters thing, and then they come in seventh? Because how do they cope with that? How do they pick themselves up? And it's resilience. I always thought I was a resilient person, but this last couple of weeks has shown me that maybe I'm not quite as resilient as I am. So
Well-
I think you're right. Failure is a good thing, and I'm sure in 6 months' time I'll come out the other end and I'll be a better person as a consequence. But at the moment, I'm fucking suffering, and it's awful. Absolutely awful. It's just
Yeah.
on my mind all the time.
Yeah.
The fact that I failed, and another person who was standing next to me who was crap passed.
That's the killer as well.
That's the killer. Why did she pass and I didn't? And of course they will. So that's the thing. I think you're right. Failure is an important thing, and I've failed in other things in my life as well.
But it makes you appreciate the success a bit more.
Yes, I mean you can say things like that, but I'd rather not have that. I'd rather win first time than I'm sure I'd appreciate it, even if I got I got it for somebody. It's awful.
I lose.
There's a strip club in LA that's quite popular, and a few fellas walk in with a lot of money, and they're making it rain and stuff, and
They're making it what?
they're making it rain.
Do you know what that is?
Yeah.
When they're like, yeah.
And because they're spending lots of money, the club's giving them a lot of free drinks and stuff. Eventually, one of the fellas they wanders over to the bar, and orders from a robot bartender, and all's well until he goes to pay, but the bot detects that he's using fake money, and so basically they're frauds, and the guy's drunk, so he tries to bribe the bot, but
With more fake money.
something like that, yeah. And the bot goes and tells the manager, and the manager calls the police. The police go into the strip club and arrest them all, and the bot gets his hand shaken.
By the police.
Yeah, that's this week's
He gets his hand shaken.
Yeah.
So they approved of his using
Yeah.
forged. Where did you get that from?
I
He can't reveal his source.
Very convenient. I think he made it up.
Hold on, how is a robot knowing that it's fake money?
It just scans it and it detects it. There's like little things you can detect with fake money.
Like what?
Like there's a little like square which sort of like has a shine to it when you point out to the sun. So
It's
I
not
guess
really
it
a
could do
robot
that.
then, is it? I mean, a robot doesn't have any sort of ability to... a robot would be one of those things that makes cars, picks up a component.
Not really. I mean, they're quite sophisticated.
But if they're that, like, why are they in a strip club? Why are they not doing more important things?
There's a lot of robot bartenders out there.
That's a lie.
Trust me. I know a guy who was on a cruise and there was a robot that served him a pint.
Very unambitious AI, mate, maybe. Why doesn't it want to be an astronaut or
Yeah.
or part
Why doesn't it want to save the world?
Because one of the purposes of AI is to do a job that is boring or monotonous, and that could be the case.
Being a
in the strip
bartender
club.
can be fun.
Yeah, but I mean, the company benefits because it's a bit cheaper. Don't have to pay a wage, and
Do you have to pay a robot if it works for you?
no, you just
Well,
pay
you
the
do.
fixed cost.
Electricity.
Yeah, I suppose.
And also, I mean, it's good for humans to do crappy jobs as well, isn't it? We need cannon fodder too.
Yeah.
That's going to be gone soon, isn't it, really?
Yeah, it won't.
Really?
No, I don't think so.
10,
Do you think
20
so?
years?
I don't think it will, no.
What, do you think we'll still be doing labour jobs?
So what's going to happen to those people who are serving in bars if they're not serving in bars?
I think some kind of universal basic income will happen, or people will have to find
We'll give them free money.
Well, I know that's a slippery slope, but I think that'll either happen, or people will just have to create more creative jobs.
What they should do is get those people, chop them up, and burn them in power stations to power the robots. That's the obvious thing.
So the people going to be powering the robots.
Yeah, like in what's that film, The Matrix?
Yeah.
That's the future. Chop them up. I bet they're obese as well. Using my semaglutide, bastards.
Oh, well, on that bombshell, thank you very much for coming on.
You're very welcome.
brilliant. I've
I've
enjoyed
enjoyed
myself.
that.
Yeah.
I have too. Thank you very
It's
much.
been a bit different to what we normally do.
Yeah.
I think, like, in a good way. Like,
Yeah.
it's
You're definitely
very-
the most qualified guest we've had so
Well, I
far.
don't qualify for what though. That's the thing. Talking bollocks.
Brilliant. All right, well, Jacob, if people have questions, where can they go?
questions at openmindedpodcast.co.uk.
And yeah, thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll see you all next week.